Hello, it's Keith here, and this is the third in my Akusprite tutorials. We've been looking over the last couple of weeks at the basics of the user interface and how to do pixel plotting. This time we're going to look at the menus and see some of the functions that may be useful to you, may not be. There's a lot of very specialist commands that were added to the menus for the purpose of me creating Chibi Akumas, mostly a few bits for Chibi Aliens and things. Now, I wanted to discuss what they do, but if you're confused by them, then you're probably going to be best using an alternate package like Krita and copy-pasting into that and doing your work in there. But I wanted to show what was available because maybe some of it will be useful for you, and maybe you'll be curious to see what some of these menu options actually mean. Okay, well, let's go over to Akusprite Editor and let's have a look at what we'll be doing. So first of all, let's start with the edit menu here. So we've got copy to clipboard and paste from clipboard. Now you've possibly seen these before. We did discuss them in a previous lesson. Now if I just open OpenView here and then I go to Tool, Edit and go copy to clipboard and then do a paste here, you can see we've pasted the entire image with a copy of the palette here. The idea being you can then use a color picker and grab data from that palette from the bottom there just to make sure your colors are correct, because when you paste back it will match the colors. Now if they're not exactly the same, it will find the closest one, but obviously the closer they are, the more likely you are to not have any problems, which is why you've got that color picker at the bottom there. So if I just make some silly little changes here, and then I just do another Control C here, and then if I go back here and do edit and paste, well, you can see the colours I've drawn in have been put back into the image here. Now this has changed to cyan because I didn't have a green here. That was the closest it could find, but you can see generally speaking we can transfer across okay. Now you also have a copy preview option. Well, what does this do? Well, this copies exactly what you were seeing just then. If I now do a paste, you can see you've now got the grid and you've not got the colour palette. So that's designed more for previews, for me making my tutorials for one thing. So not really for editing, that's more just for taking a visual representation. So this is totally affected by all of the options here. And if you want to have a preview with spectrum colours and things, that's what you'd want to use. Okay. Now you've got a canvas size option. This is just a cropping effect. So if I do 48, 48 here, well, you can see we've now just cropped away all of that rubbish, which is possibly quite handy. The actual image size can be overridden with this option here, so you'd never need to make it bigger. It's just really for cropping off junk from the edges of the image. Now you've got an option here, duplicate from. This is if you're using multiple sprites. If I go to next sprite, I can go edit, duplicate from, and select. You get a menu option here and it says copy from which sprite. If I press in 0, it will copy from the sprite there. Now this is kind of a legacy thing. It's just as easy now to do a Control C, next sprite, Control V, and you can see we can do that. So you probably don't need it anymore, but as I say, this was from before the Akusprite Editor supported the clipboard. Now another option is duplicate from offset. I'm asked for a sprite number here, so I'll just select sprite 0, and then I'm asked for an XY offset. Maybe you can guess what this will do, so I'll put 16,16, and it's pasted the sprite at an offset. Now you could do that with Krita if you didn't want to use that tool, but I obviously needed this at some point, so it's in there, but again, it's one I've not really used for a very long time. Make tiles. Now this is possibly more interesting to you. If we just go to the first sprite again and do make tiles. Now if I type in a size here, it's defaulting to 48 by 48, which is the size of the sprite. So if I put in 128, 128, it will fill the entire area with the sprite there. So maybe that's something you might need in some cases, but it's certainly a thing that's available to you. So that's all for the edit menu. It's possible I will move some of these off edit into tools because they kind of feel like editing tools are a bit blurred at the moment, but that's the way things are at the moment. Now transform. We've got flip X and flip Y. You can probably guess what they do. So you can see we can just flip our image. We've got pixel shift options, left, right, up and down. If we do pixel shift down, it asks us for a move size, and if we select 4, it moves down by 4 pixels. So these are just for shifting the image around. Again, if you don't want to use an alternative package, although in a lot of ways that would be what I would do these days. Again, this is from the early days of the tool before it was able to copy and paste to Krita. So that's why these are in here really. So that's what all of these are. Now Tile Shift X, this is an odd one. This is something that was used for creating the background tiles for Chibi Akumas on the Spectrum and MSX. Now it only works on 256 pixel wide sprites. Now if I just put some junk in here, and if I just make sure that the sprite is 256 pixels wide here, and then if I do a tool transform Tile Shift X, and if I put in here a move of 8, well, now you can see what's happened is the left hand side has moved off here and it's ended up on the right hand side here. So this was for creating the full width tile backgrounds for the Spectrum and MSX versions. As I say, it's not something you're probably ever going to want to use. I just wanted to explain what all of these tools did. So that's what those are. Now we've got an option here, Interlace Y. We've got a few interlace options and they do different things. Now originally with the first release of Chibi Akumas, there was a special accelerated mode that would draw a double height sprite, only alternating every other line on the Amstrad CPC, and it was actually half the speed because it was only drawing half the lines. To emulate this on systems like the Spectrum and the MSX, I created a tool here that would do the same thing to the sprites. If I click this, it will effectively double the height of the sprite, putting a blank line in between in the other lines. So that is effectively what it was doing, and I was using it as a sort of transparency, if you will, because obviously every other line is blank, so it's an easy way of faking transparency in a way. Okay, so that's one of the options. So I just we'll just reload here because we've made quite a mess of our Chibi codes here. Let's reload that. There we go. Now we've got some other interlacing options. We've got interlace odd fields and interlace even fields. Now what these do is these take an image and they skip every other line, and one will take the odd lines and the other will take the even lines. So you can see here we've halved our image there with the odd fields, but if we had done the opposite of even fields, we would have got the other line, the alternate set of lines. So what these are for is these are for the MSX modes where it's an interlace mode, it doubles the vertical resolution, but the odd and even fields are at different memory addresses. So what was did was split the sprite out into two parts and draw them at the different addresses. So that's just a simple way that you can create two files for that. Now set all attributes. This is another thing really for just for Chibi Akumas. The attributes here were enabling options of the sprite rendering within the Chibi Akuma's binary format. This would set all of them for all the sprites in one go. It's not something you're going to need at the moment for Akusprite Editor for any other purpose, so please disregard that function really. Here you've got black border. Now this is again relating to Chibi Akuma's MSX. On the Amstrad CPC, a byte that was entirely zeros would be not drawn, and that gave the characters a black outline often, which I quite liked. It was sort of intentional. Now on the MSX, the transparency was done by color 0, so that didn't work. So what I did is I set color 1 to black, and then I created these black border and black border tight. These both do almost the same thing. They will create an outline in color 1 of any non-zero pixels. So if I just select here black border, you can see now because color 1 is purple, the Chibico character has a purple outline. If I do that again and then I go to black border tight, well again it's the same, just slightly, it's now just using more of a cross pattern than a square pattern, so the border is a lot thinner. It was just depending on which sprite I was doing, which one was more appropriate. We got palette tint. This was again for Chibi Akuma's the cave level on the MSX. I needed to make the image palette slightly tinted blue and green and things. If we select palette tint, we're asked for a color type. So let's do 0,0,255, which is bright blue. We're then asked for a tint, and this is a value from 0 to 1. So if I put 0.25, this will tint the entire palette 1/4 blue. There we go. I did this and then I was just exporting the palettes once it was done. So very specialist tool there for Chibi Akumas once again, and you can see it's actually updated the palette here, but it's not updated the character here, which is why sometimes you might want that refresh button. There's a few little glitches in the code, shall we say. Again, it's a function I only used one day and I'll probably never use again. Tiles. This is the same as the tile functions here we discussed last time. I'm not going to go over them again. They were originally on this menu here, but it was inconvenient. And then we've got palettes here. If we select one of these palettes, it will load in a default palette. So if I select MSX and Enterprise here, you will see this is now got the palette, the 256 color palette of an MSX or Enterprise. So these are basically default palettes that we can select here. We've got a whole range of them here. We can alternatively load in palettes from Earth and View format. Now this was because if you were trying to do a 256 color or more image, Akusprite Editor doesn't have good dithering, but in OpenView does, and this was a way of loading in palettes. You don't necessarily need to do that now, because if you convert to a 256 color PNG, you can now load in from, where is it, import image. You can load in using this option, and that will load the palette in from a 256 color file, but the options still are on the palettes menu there, so you can always use them there. Okay, so that's the edit menu and the tools menu. What we're going to discuss next is the file menu. Now you've got resave, which will save with the sprites in the Akusprite Editor format of the current file. Save sprites as, which saves as a new file name. Save palette, which just saves the palette component, and that's useful if you're trying to use a palette across multiple sprites, like in your level. Alternatively though, you do have 3 import options here. Whereas the normal load option will load everything from a file, you can load in just the palette from another sprite file, or just the pixels, the normal color data from another sprite file, or just the color attributes, the spectrum color attributes, or other systems like C64 color attributes from another file. So you can use effectively any sprite file as just a palette by using these import options if you wish. You've got load recent, which shows all the recent files. This is a new copy of Akusprite, so there aren't any. You've got import image, which, as I just said, is an import tool. Now we can use from file import palette, which will load in a 16 color or 256 color palette, or from file. Now it's important to know that depending on our settings here, how that function will work will vary, because if we've got it set to 16 color, it will map to just the first 16 colors. So the import would work quite badly with this 256 color palette. We've got 256 color option, and we now have a true color option, which is very, very experimental. But the Akusprite Editor is now going up into red, green, blue, and alpha. So that's for the upcoming tutorials on the Game Boy Advance, the NDS, and hopefully one day the PlayStation and the N64, which use RGBA to some extent. So that's why Akusprite Editor has gone from a 16 color editor to a 256 color editor to a 4 billion, whatever, lots of color editor. Anyway, so yeah, lots of work going then. And you can see, what have we got set there? We got set 256 color there, but if we set the wrong setting, you see we can't see our character at all. Anyway, we do need to make sure that setting's correct. And then if we go to File, Import Image, from File, and if we just find a nice image here, let's load in UME 2 maybe. It's taking a little time because it's got to match to all of the color palette. So there's the character, it's been matched to the current palette, and we're okay with that. So that's how you can get sprites in, but that's literally identical to using copy-paste, except for the palette thing. So there's no need to use that. Copy-paste might be quicker for you, but if you want to use the import option, go ahead and use the import option. I'm totally fine with that here, whichever you prefer. Okay, we've got file processor. These are relating to the RLE compression. They will compress any file, not a sprite necessarily, but if you select a file, it will compress it into RLE, and that's the format used by Phantasy Star that I've covered in a recent Z80 tutorial. It's very simple. I'm not going to cover it here. If you want to know more, turn on the help with this button here. Click on one of these and it will jump straight to the tutorial on that. We do have these other quite interesting options, save bitmap and load bitmap, and these are a multi-sprite map. These will, let's just try these out. So I've got this example here. We've got multiple sprites here. You see, we've got basically 4 sprites here. Now, if I go here and I go save here, and then if we go to my, where we'll go, let's go to the S drive here, and we'll just call this T. Now that will have saved some files here. If I just load up here, you can see we've got a map here, and then we've got 8 files, and each file is relating to a bank. Now if you remember, Akusprite Editor supports multiple sprites and multiple banks. Now here is the map. You can see it's a huge image, but it's almost entirely unused. So each of these coloured areas represents one of the 4 sprites, and each of the colours down here represents one of the maximum 63 sprites that Akusprite Editor allows for a single bank. Now the area coloured in here is the area defined by that sprite. So if we coloured in a larger area with the same colour, it would increase the size of the sprite. Now if I go to this sprite here, bank 0, which is the only one with any sprites in it, and I zoom in, well, what you can possibly see here is we've got the 4 sprites that we were designing before. Now I can now load up my pixel painting tool here. Of course we'd really want to use Krita for this, and if I just start colouring in, maybe if I just well, we'd better use yellow maybe, because we want to use a colour that's actually in the palette. and I make some changes here, some very bad changes, I admit. So we'll do that. Now if I go over the line here, we'll see what happens, and then I'll just do a file and I'll do a save. Okay, and then if I go, let's go to this one actually, and let's do load bitmap, and then I select the map here. Well, you can see actually it's not cleared the sprites. Maybe I need to change the code there. Well, you can see that the changes I've made have been applied to the sprites here, and the sizes are actually taken from that first map file. So if you leave the first map file unchanged, the bit where I went over the lines of this sprite haven't actually been imported, and if I wanted to, I could edit the map and make those areas bigger, and they would have been imported. The size is defined by the coloured areas on this first sprite, provided I use the right colours from this bottom part here. Then you can actually import larger sprites back than you exported. The idea of this is to allow you to edit sprites entirely without using Akusprite Editor. Effectively, you could design your map using the correct colors, design your sprites for all of your banks in your krita or similar program, and then just import the map in with this option here, and then just export the sprites using the tools here. So it's kind of Akusprite Editor doesn't have a command line option yet, but it's kind of more going towards that way of automating Akusprite to just create files, and you're doing your graphics work in the package of your preference. I apologize that, as I say, it seemed to be a little bit of a glitch here that it hasn't resized this sprite or blanked this sprite out, but based on this. So maybe I should have started a new file before I did the import. But as I say, you can see it did work in general, and the map did work because it did ignore this junk here. So there we go. Okay, so we've looked at the various options there. I think we've basically covered all of the menu tools that you're likely to use. There's loads of other stuff regards to exporting for specific systems. I'm not going to cover them here because they're usually covered in another tutorial. Again, if you use the help option, if you click on the button in the bottom left and then click on the menu option, you will get help and link to that tutorial. So I'm not going to cover that kind of thing. We do need to go over a little bit more into the view options, the color options there and things. But Akusprite Editor is still being upgraded. As I say, I'm currently in the progress of upgrading it to support true color. So I can't really discuss things that aren't finished yet because they may be completely different by the time it is. But anyway, I hope you found this interesting. I'm not sure how many of these tools are useful for you, but maybe there'll be a bit of a curiosity for you. And at least next time you see the program and you're looking like, what on earth does that mean? Mate, now you'll actually know. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this. If you have, like and subscribe and all that kind of thing. Go to the website and download Akusprite Editor and Sources of 7-zip. The latest version is going to be in the Z80 tutorials now. I'm going to keep it in there just so I have fewer files to update. But whatever you do, I hope you enjoy programming. If Akusprite Editor is any use to you in your programming adventures, then that's absolutely fantastic. Thanks for watching today, and goodbye.